Okay, I think we should start already. So it's again me, Oleg Belyaev, and I'm chairing this session. And it's my pleasure to introduce Oleg Belyaev, who's going to talk about exponents of case. Please.
Thank you. The title of the talk has changed a little bit. It might seem from the title that I'm going to talk about something very theoretical and morphological. In fact, it's more a typological point, so don't be disappointed. But I will start with some general perspectives on what case is supposed to be. Here we have two definitinos of case. I'm sorry for the typo. That's a typical typo that you make when you write things like ending in shun. So we have two typical definitions of case as we find them in various textbooks. One of them is by perhaps the most widely known textbook on case by Barry Blake. Case is a system of marking dependent nouns for the type of relationships they bear to the heads. So we're talking about morphological case here, I would like to specify. And then Pulyan's definition from his grammatical semantics textbook, which says basically the same thing, that case grammes mark dependent nouns and are the encoders of its syntactically dependent status. Now, when we're talking about these kinds of morphological definitions of case, the common property of all such definitions is that they are talking about this as a noun level and not an NP level feature. They are talking about the feature of nouns or nominals that mark the dependence of these nouns on other elements. But this immediately runs into various problems if you look at how things which people call case in different grammars actually behave. One of them is the well-known phenomenon of suspended affixation, which of course presupposes a certain view that there is supposed to be a fixation on both conjuncts and a coordinate phrase, like in Turkish, Almanya ve Amerika'dan, from Germany and from America. So it is presupposed that apparently the normal situation is when you repeat the case on both conjuncts, but in many languages, especially agglutinating languages such as Turkish, you only put case on the final. Well, and you can put it on both conjuncts as well, but the typical situation, and perhaps the more frequent situation, is when the case marker only appears at the end of the whole coordinate phrase. So this kind of speaks against the idea that case is a word level feature, because here it clearly occurs only once after the whole NP. Then of course we have case agreement, a very old question in structuralist linguistics, whether it's a separate category or it's somehow spreads or it's a group feature and so on. So again, this is not exactly easy to account for in terms of word of the traditional definition. Then of course we have various categories like suffix aufnahme in Australian languages and in other areas where you have cases stacking atop other cases and marking the distribution of the whole phrase in which this element appears, which again does not mean that it marks the dependence of this element to some head, but it marks actually the case status, the dependency of the group in which this element appears. Again, this is a bit iffy if we're talking about case as a morphological category. So in practice, when people start to study case, want to determine whether a given category in a given language, a given class of markers in a given language should be called case or something else, they mostly just assume that case is a morphological category, and if we cannot prove that it is an affix, we can call it an adposition. So in most cases, if we look at descriptive grammars and then various discussions of, for example, how many cases are there in language X. Let's prove that there is another new case. We want to test, usually what people do, they test criteria like Zwick and Pugum. They just test that separability, scoping effects, and so on and so forth. So they test all these classical ideas which mark the bondedness of the element to the stem. If it's bonded to the stem, then it's a case. If it's not bonded, if it's more or less free, comparable to adposition, then it is an adposition. That's the typical situation. Then people say this language has 9 cases, this language has 11 cases, and so on. This is a bit strange, because it appears that typologically correct case is maybe one of the only grammatical features whose definition depends on affix status. Normally when we're speaking about categories, we don't care whether they are expressed agglutinatively, as particles, as auxiliaries, as whatever else. We just care whether they are obligatory, and we care about different things, but we don't usually care that they are expressed as affixes on the head. But in case of case, for some reason, we suddenly decide that we need it to be an affix, otherwise it's not a case feature. But the problem with this is also that cross-linguistically word, as shown by, among others, Martin Haspermat, and this article has been discussed a lot in various venues, but the main point is that we cannot provide a cross-linguistically stable set of diagnostics that would define as the class of words. And this is apparently something on which actually the typological functional tradition and the formal tradition seem to converge to a certain extent. So this is also a problem. If we define a category based on affix status, we suddenly run into problems because word is not a clear notion, and then how can we compare things which have different properties? And many case systems are challenging even if we assume that the traditional point of view is correct and we can easily delimit affixes from non-affixes. First of all, the group affixation, as I mentioned, it's also a problem if we say, okay, it's an affix, but how can an affix scope over a constituent? That's also not a clear thing, and especially since different systems behave differently. Why does it happen in some languages but not in the others? Then in some languages we have effects like the exponents of case. In some contexts it appears as an affix, like in Hungarian, and in other contexts it suddenly becomes more like a nominal stem to which you attach a possessive suffix, like in Spencer's famous paper where he shows that Hungarian case system doesn't look a lot like a case system because with nouns it is really a suffix, but with pronouns it's more like a stem, neck, the same as the affix to which you attach the person number features which are expressed by an affix which is the same as what happens with adpositions. So with pronouns it suddenly behaves like an adposition. Finally, two-level systems, we can sometimes have case markers stacking on top of other case markers, like in Tocharian, Carling and Kuritsina, two references here which I'm providing. Of course there are many more. And in Ossetic, for example, in Armenian and many other languages where we have different degrees of two case categories taking on top of each other, and sometimes only one case feature occurs and the other, one of them is group level, the other is constituent level. Sometimes we have the same category expressed by synthesis or periphrases in the same paradigm as in some Finno-Ugric languages. Again, here, if we define case as a morphological feature, it's a bit of a problem because then sometimes it suddenly becomes expressed analytically in the same paradigm, but with different nouns, for example, or in different slots. This phenomena, sorry for the typo, make the cross-linguistic notion of case problematic. And at least in traditional form, it does not seem to lead to any meaningful generalizations. A proposal by Martin Haspermat, essentially, which has been adopted by quite a few typologists, is to abandon the term case as a cross-linguistic notion, as typical for Martin. He proposes a new term, flag, which is supposed to cover all kinds of NP-dependent marking, both cases and adpositions. But is the typology of case as a morphological phenomenon really meaningless, as this seems to imply? For example, there is a nice dissertation by Peter Arkadyv called The Typology of Two Case Systems. Maybe Peter has misnamed his dissertation, should have been called Typology of Two Flag Systems. Well, maybe he agrees, but I disagree. I think there is something meaningful, even though in this dissertation he says that actually he's looking at a more broad category, but actually I believe that most of his cases are something different from, are really cases and not just flags, which just happen to have only two terms, and the fact that they have only two terms is actually also symptomatic because more things we call adpositions are usually more of an open class, but this is a separate issue. Yeah. But intuitively it seems that the traditional Indo-European style nominal inflection systems do seem to form a kind of a natural class which has some set of properties that stick together. It would be nice to try to define what we're talking about here. And the idea that came to me before I started doing this research is that since modern morphology is more concerned with paradigms and their interrelations rather than words on affix status, maybe we should actually start defining case not by reference to bondedness and to morpheme status, but by reference to the structure of the paradigms in which case markers appear. And here I have an illustration. We have two systems which have been called case systems. One is a very reduced old French system with just two categories, and the other is basically, you know, in the Dagestanian languages, when people discuss these languages, they start saying that they're very complex, they have many cases, and so on, and Tavasaran is in the World Record Book, Guinness, and so on. But if we look at the structure of the paradigm, in a certain sense, the French system is more complex than the Darbois system, because Darbois system involves the same affixes attaching in the same form to all nouns, more or less, with some more phonological idiosyncrasies, but generally it is all very straightforward. In the plural you have the plural marker, then the case marker, then in the locative cases you have stacking of location and orientation markers, while in French you have a very interesting pattern of syncretism, where the singular direct case is the same as the plural oblique, and the other way around. And it seems that if we changed the hyphens with spaces in Darbois, we wouldn't have altered much. It was just be an orthographic convention. But in French, apparently there's something else going on here, and we would want to say that French is something different from Dargois. The category of case in French is somehow more of a real morphological case than what we see in languages like Dargois, Turkish, and so on and so forth, in a certain sense. And here I provide a quote from Peter Arkadiev in order to appease the chair so that he can give me more time perhaps. Here, actually one of the inspirations for this work has been, there's been a big discussion on LinkedIn on Haspermat's paper recently on affixes, and I liked a lot the formulation of Peter, who said that basically many contemporary morphologists do not use the concept of morpheme at all, operating with features and the exponents and paradigmatic relation between words, and instead. And if word is not well defined, then morpheme is still worse. So maybe we should start with morphological structure of paradigms, and not abandon the idea that we can define affixes, words, and so on, and start from this direction. And here I'm basing my work on the ideas of Andrew Spencer, Ryo Toguro, who in turn are basing their ideas on the work of Beard, who proposed to use the term morphological case, as Spencer calls it, M case, only for those systems which require which require reference to the feature case independent of its morphological realization. So here we have an example of what they propose, is that they propose to only treating as morphological case those systems where we have a non-trivial mapping between the affix, the exponent, and the grammatical function. So let's take Russian. Russian has, let's say, we cannot assign to affix R one set of syntactic functions, because the affix R can mean either the nominative or the genitive or something else, depending on the inflection class, on some more phonological factors, and so on and so forth. So in Russian, we have to assume that there is an extra category of case which provides us an equivalence class between bundles of grammatical functions and bundles of exponents. Now, if we look at a language like Bashkir, we see a different picture. In Bashkir, we have a more or less direct correspondence between the affix and the feature. If we create such a set of features, we will have just a direct. Genitive will always be expressed by khin, nominative will always be 0, and accusative will always be nu. So here Spencer and Toguro propose that we could just get away without postulating a morphological case feature and directly say that this affix encodes, this is the meaning of this affix, this is the functions of this specific affix or exponent or whatever you prefer to say. So there is not much difference in terms of function, in terms of paradigm structure between affixes, such affixes, and postpositions. They are more fused, yes, they are more bonded, but there is no structural difference. And while Spencer's argument is purely theoretical, and he starts from the assumption that we are talking about morphological phenomena, I propose instead reversing this Spencer's analysis and using Beard's criterion as the starting point for determining the morphological or syntactic status of an element. And then we'll see whether any interesting generalizations follow. So the goals of this study is to formulate Beard's criterion as a kind of comparative concept of M case. So the definition, importantly, must not refer to notions such as affix, clitic, and so on. It should stem directly from the interrelations between forms, between exponents of different categories. Then establish whether MK status correlates with lack of syntactic autonomy, and here I'm looking at two parameters. The first parameter is the possibility of group marking. So the assumption is that the possibility of group marking is a feature which is more typical for non-morphological categories. Hence, if a case category is an M case in terms of Spencer, it should not allow us to have group affixation. And second, obligatory NP-internal case concord is a more syntacticized feature. If a case feature can spread and has to spread within an NP on adjectives and other constituents, then it should be an M case. So only M cases should be able. This is the hypothesis that maybe only M cases it will correlate with the status of a case as a morphological case in terms of Spencer. So that's my hypothesis, that if you have two implicational universals, if we have group affixation, then the case cannot correspond to Beard's criterion in terms of Spencer, and if we have NP-internal case concord, then this category should have M case status. It should have either syncretism or cumulation or other things like this in the paradigm. It's clear that we cannot trust the terms used in grammars. We cannot trust people calling things cases or expositions, so I propose using as a benchmark 3 instantiations of diagnostics that show that the system corresponds to Beer's criterion. First, the presence of syncretism. If a case system has syncretism, then we assume that it corresponds to Beer's criterion. Then cumulation. If the case feature can be cumulated with a different grammatical feature, it also requires reference to the case feature independently of its morphological realization. Hence, the system corresponds to Beer's criterion. Finally, inflection classes are something which Spencer himself acknowledged as the main diagnostic. If we have inflection classes, if we have lexical variation between case markers, then or case and something else markers, then it corresponds to Beer's criterion, because we require to refer to the feature of case independently of the morpheme which encodes it, right? Importantly, the definitions would be independent of affix or word status. I take any system of basic NP flags. So in Russian it will be, of course, the cases as we know them, but in Japanese this will be those at positions. I, no, u, ni. I consider no and ni to be the cases which I analyze, because they are the first dependency marker which attaches to a noun or to an NP, and things like where above, which technically fulfill the role of at positions, are second level, so I don't take them. I only take the first level at positions, but I don't care whether they are classified as cases or at positions in traditional grammar. So Japanese would have genitive, dative, and so on, as described. Thank you. As described in, for example, Soviet descriptions. So syncretism, I look at the paradigm. If I see that the equivalence of terminal cells in a single paradigm, I classify the language as having syncretism, cumulation, according to more than one grammatical feature, and inflection, lexically conditioned variation, case exponents. The sample has, well, I won't describe the sample in detail, but it has 107 languages with a fairly high level of genetic and areal diversity, although probably not the most balanced of the samples, because it does have certain limitations. It's not always clear from the grammar. Even such simple things are not always clear from grammars, and there are not always facts on coordination available. So here, these are the languages, the orange guys are languages in my sample which have case according to Beer's criterion, which have M case, and the blue guys are those which do not. So as we see here, case seems to be areally distributed. So in Eurasia it's very frequent, in the Caucasus of course, in South Asia, in Australia, but in other areas of the world it's more of in isolated pockets of case markers. As for the syntactic parameters with which I look at the correlation, for group fixation I consider the main diagnostic group fixation under coordination. So if we have coordinate phrases and the case marker occurs only on the last conjunct or the first conjunct, it doesn't matter, then we assign the feature group. If not, then it's not a group marker. If there is no such data, I also treat data where the case suffix moves to the last non-head dependent also as a diagnostic for group fixation, right? Like in this case, my son died from a deadly high fever. The high fever is the head, deadly is the adjunct, but the case marker attaches to the whole phrase. It attaches after deadly, because it always attaches to the last element of the NP. Well, in case of concord, I only look at obligatory cases of case concord in continuous noun phrases. So as to distinguish this from cases where you have discontinuous things or two independent NPs which just appear to be in agreement. Now the results. It seems that the first universal does seem to be a tendency, but on first glance there are so many exceptions. There are like 9 exceptions, which is a lot, which is like, you see 10% of the sample, and in terms of this tetrachoric table there is even more if you look at rows and columns independently. So this is a bit unsettling. In the case of concord, the second universal, that obligatory case concord can only occur in M-case system, it's slightly better, but the sample is very unbalanced towards languages which don't have concord, which is a bit of a problem which we'll address later. But for now, let's look at why we have so many exceptions to the first universal. Well, most of these exceptions have a very similar structure, and they can be explained by the coexistence of two case-like categories within the same paradigm. In such systems, Beer's criterion is invariably only satisfied by the more morphologized word-level categories that are incapable of group exponents and can sometimes trigger NP concord. In contrast, group-level markers are always morphologically transparent and are not involved in agreement or concord. A very clear example is Oromo, the Cushitic language of North Africa, of Ethiopia, where we have word case versus phrase final case, which is defined as such in Owens's grammar. Word case triggers concord, like in this example, rich man has subject marker on both elements, and marks only the head of the noun phrase, not the edge. Group case is different, it doesn't trigger concord as we see here, and marks the final constituent of the noun phrase. Right? They look at us with unsympathetic eyes. I is the head, the case occurs on the adjective bed. So this is a clear example. Somewhat more complex are systems where markers of one category layer on top of the other. And a very good example are Dagestanian languages, one of them Krys. So here we see the typical Dagestanian structure of the paradigm, where we have absolutive and genitive cases, which are underived. So the absolutive is the base stem. The genitive is either expressed by an affix, or in some stems it has a different affix. In other stems it's simply a zero, so the nominative and genitive are syncretic. So we see both syncretism and lexical variation, and to a certain extent cumulation, but other cases are formed on the basis of the genitive form, and they always have uniform affixes in all. I believe I'll have to take some time from the discussion because I still have some things to say. So they always have uniform exponents throughout the paradigm. So only the genitive displays syncretism and is lexically conditioned. Other case markers are invariant in all contexts. And at first sight, this is a typical Dagestanian two-stem systems. We just have two stems. One of them just happens to have the same form as the genitive. But it turns out that the genitive in compound forms actually has morphosyntactic independence, as shown from coordination facts like this one, about a poor man and his wife. Here, the second level case marker, the locative case marker, is attached to the whole noun phrase, but the first conjunct stands in the oblique case. So the marker on which the chigar case marker is based actually is retained under coordination, right? So it would be something like chi rar, and here rar attaches to the whole phrase, but chi is repeated on both conjuncts, which shows that they are two different categories, which just are co-expressed in the same paradigm. Therefore, Krys has two case-like features: n-level case, which triggers concord and scopes over coordination, so it doesn't scope over coordination, and np-level case, it's that way around, it's a typo, right? So n-level case triggers concord and does not scope over coordination, whereas np-level case does not trigger concord and does scope over coordination. So according to my definition of case, Krys is a two-case language. It only has two m-case features. The rest is just in our typology, this is actually analogous to what we see in Indo-Aryan, for example, where we have the old Sanskrit system reduced to a two-case paradigm, right, like lurka, but sati has the same form in Hindi, in both direct and oblique cases. But there are also a set of clitics which attach to these oblique forms and have more autonomy. The only difference is that in Indo-Aryan, no one claims that these are affixes, apart from some languages like Romani, but in most Indo-Aryan languages they are clitics. But in our typology this does not matter. All of these things, the Krys secondary cases, the Indo-Aryan clitics, fall into the same class as adpositions. And in most exceptional systems there are only two cases. So in Adigi, Eastern Armenian, Ossetic, Kannada, and Hunzip. Here on the slide I won't go into detail, but in all of them it seems there is a binary basic. Of course, in Adigi it's a bit complex, but in terms of our comparative concepts, it is like this. If we are speaking about comparative concepts, then this will be the other question is their behavior, miscibility, and so on. But otherwise, it does seem that they are different kind of animals than the instrumental and the adverbial. I won't go into detail because we don't have enough time. So if we reconsider the universals changing this parameter mapping, then we see that actually the universals are much better. There are only three exceptions. One of them is French because of cumulation and things like or and du, which might be actually a morphonological thing. And this typology cannot distinguish morphonology from non-morphonology in a general sense, right? Because I cannot go into the detail of every language and provide an analysis of its morphosyntax. So maybe the number of exceptions can be decreased. We should go into each of them and see what happens there, because that's the point of this typology. It's not a thing in itself. It is supposed to check a theoretical statement. The second universal has one less exception. It's not very robust, but if we balance the sample for the Beard criterion, if we make it so that the number of languages which conform to the Beard criterion do not is the same, if we remove randomly those languages which are not Beard, then we have actually a much better situation. So it seems that there is a tendency that if a language does not conform to Beard's criterion, it cannot have concord. So in order to have concord in a noun phrase, the paradigm must have a degree of complexity as defined in this definition. This I will skip. This is a trivial step. So diachronically also we have some very interesting situations where, like in Armenian, where the loss of agglutination and the development of flexion has led to the loss of case concord and development of group fixation. So sorry, how much time do we have from the discussion? Like 2 minutes? 5. Okay, so I'm finishing. So in Armenian, thank you. So in Armenian we have this situation intercarrion, the accusative became constituent level after new cases were grammaticalized from adpositions. In Lithuanian, apparently the other way around, new illative, allative, and adhesive cases immediately became case markers, integrated into the paradigm, triggered case concord, even though they didn't pass through the group stage precisely because of paradigmatic pressure from other case suffixes, as I hypothesized. So this approach seems more robust than prior definitions based on words and affixes, because MK status robustly predicts lack of group marking, and case concord is only possible in MK systems. Therefore, in contrast to Haskell remarks, but also in partial agreement, the morphology syntax distinction can be cross-linguistically adequate, but the range of purely morphological phenomena is much narrower than traditionally assumed, and at the same time, most kinds of nominal flag systems fall into the same class as adpositions, regardless of the degree of bondedness. So there is a place for morphology, but it's a bit of a narrow one in this study. Okay, so I'll put the problems here on the slide and will not say them aloud. Thank you very much, and sorry for everyone.
So, thank you very much, Oleg. We'll have some 5 minutes for discussion. Please, Katya, and then
Dima.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask you, what do you think about the syntactic status of those NP level cases? So I don't like the idea that there are adpositions, because there are adpositions that govern those cases. But it's impossible for one adposition to take another adposition like PP complement.
Well, I have a paper on aesthetic where I proposed that category case P or KP. So cases are different, they have a different category of state, but it's an LFG, so I'm not sure if this will be translatable to other frameworks, but the idea is that they are different kind of syntactic category.
It's
something in
between a feature and head.
Well, it is, because also in these languages it doesn't have separate. If we are talking about lexicalist frameworks, then they do not have independent exponents. They are always exposed together with a different head. So there are two heads which always have to have the same morphological mapping. So they map to one word. There is never a separate word which expresses the K head. In this sense, it's in between, but still, in the constituent structure, I represent it as a head. That's the most straightforward account.
So maybe one more thing to say. So probably the existence of caseless form can be used here. So maybe it's also a criterion.
Yeah, if there's a separate caseless form, it's clearly a criterion. And in languages like Oromo, for example, which I showed here, there's actually a difference between bare noun and nominative, but it's a marked nominative language, so it's a different story. But in aesthetic, for example, I propose in my analysis, for example, that there is a difference between nouns unmarked for case and nouns marked for nominative. So there are different feature sets which lead to different predictions. So yes, I totally agree that this is, thank you very much, that's a good idea to stress that caseless forms are the other side of the same coin. Not necessarily, but usually yes. Usually yes. Yeah.
Well, if you assume that morphological case is a feature, how high or how low would you expect it to arise?
What do you mean in the syntactic structure? Well, I'm a lexicalist, so I assume it's just on the head. I do LFG. I don't do minimalism. It's for you to do the analysis. I'm a lexicalist, so I don't care. I don't care about such stuff.
Very short question. Have you reached any conclusion about Hungarian? Does it have any morphological case or only adposition?
Well, I agree with Spencer in this respect. So he says it's not a case.
Paper by Denis Cresset. You know that?
Well, I know Denis, but I'm not aware of this paper. What does he argue there?
Sure.
Yeah.
So he wrote a paper about Hungarian, which I actually never finished reading, but never mind. So I think he says that there is just one case, one true case in Hungarian, probably accusative.
Yeah, it might be.
So it might be relevant, I think, to add it to your
Yeah, thank you very much. That actually corresponds very well to the other examples which I gave here for two-level systems. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Still time for a very short question.
Have you considered, or is there a correlation between which functions are expressed by the particular formant and whether it is an M case or not?
Well, you see here that usually it's quite expected that the M cases are usually quite big. If you have a two-case system, for a two-level system, usually the M cases are things like absolutive oblique, nominative oblique, and so on, and genitive. So core cases are usually, if we have a distinction of two categories, if we have a two-level system, quite expectedly the M case is more core level, and various locative things and peripheral things are E case, external case, but of course there is a middle ground, like in Indo-Aryan where we have ergative and so on. So generally the tendency is like this, which corresponds to the diachrony because these are usually the older ones anyway. So they are more grammatical distance, more bleached semantically, so to speak.
Ludmila Viktorovna, only if very short.
Do you think that agglutinative languages have less hopes to have cases because there is no accumulation in them?
Yeah, that's basically the conclusion. Yeah, that we expect agglutinating languages to have group affixation, to have no concord. So we don't expect, if we see agglutinating paradigm of case markers, we expect that there will not be concords of adjectives and heads, for example, and that these markers will generally scope over noun, or at least it will be possible for them to scope over coordinate noun phrases or over constituents. So yeah, it does seem so that, I mean, agglutination is an epiphenomenon, right? I mean, agglutination can turn into flexion at some point, and then you will have, like it happened in, well, it didn't happen in any of these examples, but we had the other way around when a system changed from flexional to agglutinating, like Armenian, and suddenly the case became a group feature. So in Old Armenian, we had a case system which was typical in the European. We had concord, we had no group affixation, we had syncretism, accumulation, and so on. In modern Armenian, it's mostly agglutinating, and suddenly we have group affixation and we have no case syncretism. So in this respect, yeah, there is such a tendency. Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much for a fascinating talk and no less fascinating discussion. We have to move on.